Good morning, guys. We're not going to do any Bible reading. Today is Sunday, and we should do it on Sunday, right? But today is the rest day, the Sabbath day. So I don't know if you have your own church home you want to go visit today or not. I'm going to be visiting probably next Sunday to my church home. It's still a bit cold for me, and I have to get you have to put the dress on, the heels, the stockings, and all that. It's like too cold. So I'm hoping to get my car worked on. I don't know. My daughter's supposed to help me with jumping the battery and things. So we'll see if that comes to pass. If not, I'll have to walk in the cold next weekend to church. And it's chillingly cold where I live. It's cold and it's springtime. It's like, and then they're talking about it's going to snow. So it's not the spring I would like to have. It's not warm enough for me. But you can't do anything about it. It's the way the world goes. You just put your coat on and keep going and wait on the flowers to pop up and the sun to come out one day. But I'm on here today because, I haven't been reading this book that we've been trying to get to, the It's Not What You Think book by Jeffrey Bethink. So I'm going to read a little bit of that, and then that's it for today. Because I have, just to rest, just to do my cleaning and things I normally do. And then I'm actually doing some research for you guys about some chapters regarding David. So I'm going to mention that again when we start our reading on coming up on tomorrow. So this book says it's not what you think. We're all the way back here in almost the back of the book. This is chapter 7. The kingdom is not where you think. It says the last shall be first. And this is by Jefferson Bethink. It says it was a Sunday afternoon right after I finished speaking to a youth group. The young pastor and his wife were asking us to lunch after the service, but I quickly jumped in and said no. Alyssa then gave me that look. Why can't we go out to lunch with them? I couldn't really produce a good reason except that Alyssa and I had already planned to picnic that day. The truth was, I intended to propose to her in just a couple of hours. I still remember the moment. I had two of my buddies go ahead of me to the location, a nice little private beach area overlooking the Puget Sound. I had them go a few hours before to set up everything. I printed out every picture we had ever taken in our relationship and had one of them post those on the fence leading down to the bench, along with the rose petals and candles. My other buddy set up a couple of cameras too. I'm a YouTuber, I have to record everything. I felt like a Secret Service agent. I even had a microphone taped under my shirt the whole time. I had this grand picture in my mind, but when I got to the moment, I was so awkward. I had all this stuff I wanted to say, but literally could barely get any of it out. I think it's the only time in my life when I've been at a loss for words and stumbled through sentences I'm not even sure were English. One thing I did was read a journal entry to my future wife that I'd written a couple of years before and told Alyssa I believed that was her. Then I got on a thermos of hot water and a bowl and proceeded to wash Alyssa's feet. It sounds sweet, but honestly, it was kind of awkward. Do I just kind of take the washcloth and rub her feet, or do I get in the nooks and crannies and make sure they are totally clean? Is my washing them telling her that her feet are dirty and they need cleaning? In reality, when I was washing her feet, I told her I wanted this to be a symbol of our relationship. I wanted to serve her, love her, and cherish her. It was a moment I won't forget. But I haven't always kept that promise. There are times I'm selfish, impatient, and unloving, And I have to return again and again to that feet washing, that service, that love. Functionally, foot washing made a lot more sense in first century Palestine since everyone was usually wearing retro Birk skin stocks. Their feet would get filthy from the dust and whatever else was left scattered on paths and streets. Because of the nature of foot washing, especially in a Jewish culture of daily and ritual cleanliness, it was even beneath Jewish slaves to wash someone's feet. Most prominent Jews had a slave at the door who would untie your sandals, but it was usually reserved for the person himself to wash his own feet with water provided by the host. So you can see just how lowly and scandalous Jesus' actions are in John 13. Toward the end of his life, he was having a meal with his disciples and then took off his outer garments, tied a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet. That'd be like the President of the United States taking off his suit, getting on his hands and knees, and washing your feet after a long hike in the mountains. It would feel weird and almost inappropriate. We probably would have reacted the same way Peter did and refused it. But Jesus insists. He even goes on to tell Peter that if he doesn't let him wash Peter's feet, then Peter has no part in him. When Jesus was done, he said, "A servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him." I think washing someone's feet holds the same shock value today as it did 2,000 years ago. And so we shouldn't be afraid to do it from time to time for friends, enemies, and in moments where we want to disturb and disrupt people to ask us about Jesus. But I also think foot washing can be metaphorical. Essentially, it's serving. It's taking the lowest seat and doing what others won't. Jesus clearly states that the kingdom operates and sees power differently than the world. According to Jesus, the powerful are the servants, the ones who make themselves last. I'm challenged to live this out every day of my marriage. For 23 years, I was conditioned to see that life was about my priorities, my goals, and the other details of my life. Yet Jesus strangely says, if we want to find our lives and find joy, we have to lose them. We have to give them up. There are moments I wish more often when I sit and rest in Jesus and am able to turn to Alyssa and serve her. For the longest time, we argued over making the bed. To Alyssa, it's what starts the day and makes the day feel right. It gives a joy and attitude about the day. For me, I think it's ridiculous because I have a tough time doing something I know I would get messed up every 24 hours for the rest of my life. Some people like to make the bed, right? But I finally decided to put my argument aside and simply serve Alyssa. Even though it's something really small, I understand what Jesus was talking about. There's this strange joy that begins to come after I make the bed. I do admit it looks nice, but more important, it does something for Alyssa. She feels loved, cherished, and valued. It creates this dynamic and spirit about our relationship that fills us, gives us joy, and brings us just a tiny bit closer together. It even produces this dance-like rhythm in our marriage in which we are mutually serving and dancing with each other in love. And if you've been in the spot, you know that's the spot we were created for. That's the kingdom. What could you do today or tomorrow that hoists the kingdom flag of serving? I think drastic things specifically have a way of shocking people out of their worldview and making them even for a second ask why. We talk a lot about Jesus, but if we watch someone, some more feet, more people might start following him. What would it look like if you tried to think of something creative that could serve your peers or friends? If you are in a college, maybe knock on dorm doors and ask them if you can do a load of their laundry. Sounds absurd, but can you imagine what a person would think if you asked that? That moment might stick with them for years. And it took you maybe 20 minutes. Warning, if it's a freshman guy's clothing, you might need a biohazard suit. The best part about Jesus and his kingdom is it's creative. He spits in the mud, rubs it on his hands, smears it on a guy's eyes, and the man's healed. He tells Peter, hey, go look in that fish mouth. There will be money. Don't be afraid to be creative in serving others because it just might show them a little sparkle of what Jesus is like. And they'll then check out the source. The next part is called the sword or the cross. One thing that stood in stark contrast to Rome was that the kingdom of Jesus seemed to think self giving love could conquer enemies, while Rome thought killing the enemy would do the trick. It's hard to read the New Testament and not think America looks a lot more like the Empire of Rome than the kingdom of Jesus. I agree with New Testament right. When God wants to change the world, he doesn't send in the tanks. He sends in the meek, the mourners, those who are hungry and thirsty for God's justice, the peacemaker, and so on. Did you know the Pentagon spends more on war than all 50 states spend on health, education, welfare, and safety combined? As a country, we spend more on our military than the next 15 countries combined. If we are to be people of the light, we would study history. Looking back, it's easy to see the empire that thought it could get what it wanted by killing people doesn't exist anymore. The kingdom that thought it could transform people's lives by loving them still exists and is growing. And some might say, well, Jesus' world was different than ours, to which I'd answer, you're right, it was way worse. The Jewish people technically had been back from exile for almost 500 years by the time of Jesus. They were exiled out of Israel where they were living. They were sent out. They were sent out of where they were living. And this was for 500 years, as he said. When Jesus was born, they were coming back. And, you know, Herod was the president. He was the king or the president, the king, and he was killing Jews. And he wanted to kill all the babies that were being born. Jesus was one of them. So, yet for almost the entire period, outside of a few blips of the radar, the Persian, Greek, or Roman Empire ruled them all but about 25 of those years. For the Jewish people, this indicated something deeply wrong. God had promised to establish his reign and rule and do something new and explosive in Israel. You know, he had promised that this would be their land, and they were journeying all the way from the time of Abraham to get to this land. You know, that's what we're reading about in the Bible. And so they were exiled when they got to where they were trying to go. So anyway, let's keep going here. God had promised to establish his reign and rule and do something new and explosive in Israel. If Cyrus or Alexander the Great or Caesar was still ruling Judea, then that meant it hadn't happened yet. The Jewish people were anxiously waiting for a leader to rise up to do what they had read about in the prophets: crush the enemies, defeat the occupying country, and establish Israel as its own sovereign nation again. When was God going to establish his kingdom for Israel and the faithful? Little did they know he was about to do that very thing, but in a radically different way than anyone expected. A lot of people figured this would happen through, you guessed it, physical violence. That's how it happened in the Old Testament. And that's how Judas Maccabeus attempted it 200 years earlier, because that's simply the only way to get rid of a foreign occupier through war. And yet, Jesus radically opposed that violence. In fact, in every instance, that killing the enemy becomes a viable option for the followers of Jesus in the gospel, Jesus blatantly condemns it. When Peter cuts off a man's ear to protect Jesus, he rebukes him harshly. When Jesus triumphantly enters Jerusalem, he cries because Jerusalem did know the thing that makes for peace, that make for peace. When Jesus is arrested and taken to a Roman execution device, he seems to give up no fight. When two disciples asked to be placed at his left hand and right his in his kingdom, they thought Jesus was going to violently take the temple back and establish his earthly rule. They thought he was going to fight to get it. He says they clearly do not know what they are asking. It was clear by the fact he was gaining and attracting such large crowds that people thought God's long awaited promise to crush Rome and establish Israel forever was coming true in Jesus. And as so, Jesus very quickly goes right to the people's heart. He puts his cards on the table. In the very first sermon in Matthew, famously called the Sermon on the Mount, which, by the way, as we've already seen previously, wasn't just potent teaching, but set up by Matthew to tell the reader, this is the new Torah, this is the new law, this is the manifesto for Jesus' followers. It wasn't just a nice teaching that we can put on a coffee cup, but something we are responsible to live out if we call ourselves Jesus followers. Jesus explicitly addresses the Old Testament way of doing things. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Jesus is saying, I know you've heard it a certain way. I know you think that way is right. But if you want to be a part of this movement, turning the world upside down and living in my kingdom, then you need to love your enemies. He even goes so far to say, if someone slaps you, turn the other cheek. If they take your tunic, give them your cloak. To really sit it in just how dangerous this would have sounded to any first century ears. Think about this. Remember how you felt on September 11th, 2001, the shock, the ache, the pain, the anger. Now imagine it wasn't just the World Trade Center towers, but the White House too, the very symbol of our nation. Now, try to imagine that those responsible for September 11th had ruled America for the previous century and before some other emperors had ruled us. Imagine we were kept from doing the very thing that made us American. The Republic was completely squashed. Capitalism and entrepreneurship were condemned. People, by and large, were not free. There was oppression. Your siblings and family were being killed without consequence, and there were other brutal conditions that made living incredibly terrible. Everyone, no matter what they believed, had to give allegiance to Allah. There was no religious freedom, as we pride ourselves on in the Constitution. If people were out of line, they would just get killed or imprisoned. What would be your response to this? Most likely, especially if it's true American spirit, we do anything in our power to take down the force occupying us. We wait for any opportunities to defeat the evil guys occupying our country and land, to reclaim America and reestablish its beauty, honor, democracy, and patriotism. we'd have visions of taking back the White House and raising the American flag on the front lawn. Our hope, though it were honest, starts to become dismal, realizing that for 12 generations, nothing has changed and we haven't been able to get our country back. Then let's imagine a leader comes along and says, instead of taking back America, instead of staging a coup, instead of taking down the enemies, love them, forgive them, wash their feet, bless them, and if it calls for it, die for them. Even if they've killed your family and friends and have made your entire life a nightmare. Not only would that be offensive, it probably deeply anger a lot of us. Doesn't that leader know the pain, the ache, the grief, and oppression this regiment has caused? Then let's imagine that leader causes quite a stir in saying all this, and in turn is arrested and then brutally tortured in Times Square on camera for the entire nation to see. And at the end of the torture, he is hung and executed. Hope is squashed, and this leader who brought us the hope of getting our country back is publicly executed, which would have clearly meant it was a failure. His plan obviously didn't work, yet a couple of weeks later, something strange happens. A small group of people claim he came back to life. He came back to life a few days after he died, and the very minute he was killed was actually peculiarly and mysteriously the answer to everyone's problems. And in fact, is this very event that will save and restore the entire world. That is how ridiculous the cross looks to any faithful Jew living in Israel in the first century. Rather than being the moment of victory, the cross provided the very opposite. A crucified Messiah isn't a Messiah at all. All the hopes of Jesus restoring the kingdom of Israel were crushed the minute the Romans drove nails into his wrists and feet. And all the followers of Jesus thought they had wasted the past 3 years of their lives. Israel was occupied for so long they almost couldn't remember what it meant to be in their own land without anyone else running the show. Yet, in that moment, love strangely won. Jesus, even in the middle of the execution, says, while on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus could have easily crushed the oppression. He could have easily called down an army of angels to absolutely slaughter everyone who oppressed and hurt Israel. Instead, he knew the way to change the world was through sacrificing his own life. And he calls us to do the same. That's a strong task, a strong call. But if we are Jesus followers, that's the path carved for us. Sacrificial love, giving one's life on behalf of another, is the way of our Lord. It must be our way too. It's one of the most defining marks of a Jesus Kingdom citizen. As Pastor Brian Zad put it, ultimately, we cannot eliminate enemies through violence. Violence only multiplies enemies. The only way to eliminate enemies is to love them, forgive them. This isn't just a nice concept, it's intensely pertinent right now since ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, is all over the news for brutal and grotesque violence in some regions of Iraq and Syria. They are going on a graphic conquest, destroying anything that doesn't line up with their vision of the world. Beheadings are being shown on TV and the internet. Daughters are being raped. People are being sold as slaves. Just reading about some of the actions of the group made me physically ill. Barbaric, grotesque, and brutal actions. Hundreds of thousands of people in the area have been displaced, hurt, abandoned, and are on the run. I ache for my brothers and sisters there. One thing that is particularly painful is how I'm afraid we will only stand with them as long as the news cycles last. But if we are Jesus followers, we stand against such atrocity not for 2 weeks, but for good. We use our lives and our means to say no.
That is not okay, and God is not pleased. Jesus is God's answer to evil, and it must be ours too. All throughout history, God has creatively curbed evil and brought about justice. A beautiful symbol of this is the Tree of Life in the British Museum, where assault rifles and machine guns used in the Mozambique Civil War were taken by authorities in exchange for shovels, sewing machines, and even a tractor. Four war survivors broke the weapons and formed a tree depicting life, forgiveness, new start, and peace. It's a perfect representation of God's heart declared in Isaiah. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many people. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. One thing that's even harder to imagine, though, is if ISIS were in control of where I live. What if those atrocities were happening right now in the middle of our country? What if you could defeat this evil, completely crush it, show it for what it is? Even that does not belong in this world or God's plan. Would you? Of course. But let's take another step further. Ultimately, we know if all of ISIS is killed, another group sooner or later will rise up, which did so. So what if instead of just defeating the group called ISIS, you could defeat evil itself? What if the force, the spirit, the evil behind all tangible evil could be destroyed? Would you? Of course you would. The truth is, that's already happening according to claims of a first century rabbi in Judea. And he said it's already happened. Get this. When he was executed by the Romans and resurrected 3 days later, that is the most explosive, countercultural, ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Jesus said he defeated evil in a 6-hour event, then that left him in agony, bloodied to a pulp and dangling from a piece of wood. That's the foolishness of the cross Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians. And if Jesus said that and modeled that, the question becomes, do we really trust him that the Jesus way is the way? For thousands of years, Jesus' followers have altered history, changed cultures, and left lasting legacies simply because they believed this to be true. When they were thrown to lions and had their bodies ripped, no chewed apart, they bled love, not hatred. When Peter was crucified, he didn't pull out the sword as he did on the night of Jesus' arrest. He asked to be crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy of dying the same way as his Lord. I read about a Christian man who heard guards coming to his door to arrest him and take him to his execution. He quickly greeted them and asked if he could cook them a warm meal since they had traveled all that way, and then they could take him. Enemy love changes the world. Enemy love breaks and transforms hearts. Enemy love makes people look to Jesus. And enemy love is non negotiable in the kingdom. This topic brings up loads of practical questions that space here won't allow. And also because I don't know the answer to a lot of those questions. But the big question is, are we even having this conversation? Are we wrestling? This concept isn't one that's nice and tidy. It deserves creative solutions. I'm learning day by day to really trust that Jesus knew what he was doing. He can be trusted. His way is the way of the future, like we talked about in chapter 4. It is foolishness to the world, but somehow the mysterious heart of God says that that is the way. And looking back on church history, time and time again, radical love doesn't defeat evil. And then the next part says, thankfulness is the secret. Foot washing and enemy love aren't the only markers of a kingdom citizen. Thankfulness, too, is a badge that should mark us as Jesus followers. I'm going to stop right there, but I'll pick it up later, guys. I'm getting tired. I'm starting to read really fast because I'm tired. So let's just take a break. Have a great day.